All right. Welcome to Graphic Policy Television, GPTV. I'm Brett. In my hands is Smahtguy, The Life and Times of Barney Frank by Eric Orner, who is joining us to discuss this intriguing graphic memoir. So to give a little background, I think this would be kind of fun. I worked as part of the Massachusetts delegation back in 2002, 2004, somewhere around there for Senator Kerry for like 2.5 years or so. I think I met the congressman a couple of times. Didn't have tons of interactions with him, but definitely had an opinion from the distance about him. So this is actually gonna be really entertaining. So one, welcome. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. And the other is I love the graphic memoir. Yeah, I think you saw the review of it.
I did, and I'm so pleased. So thank you. And I should say I once met. Sorry,
no, go for it.
But I know that you worked for Senator Kerry. In my earlier life, I had a comic strip called Ethan Green, called The Mostly Unfabulous Social Life of Ethan Green, and it took off in the early 90s, and I got invited to speak back then to a big event in Atlanta, which I have no connection with at all. And I was living in Boston at the time, and I was practicing my little talk in Boston Common, just sort of speaking it aloud to the trees, but I was looking at my notes, and your old boss walked by me and said, study the notes for a day and then leave them at home and then do it in the park. Like, don't do it with you. And it's worked. I have taken that advice to heart. And, on the occasion where I have to, talk in public for whatever reason, I mean, not necessarily for something like this, it can be, giving a toast at a wedding. Like he said, one day, just study it. You'll get what you need out of it, and then walk away from the notes. And so,
sounds about right.
I own that.
That sounds about right. I think he might have been the smartest person I've ever worked for. It was a very interesting time. Let's go with that, because it was also his presidential run. So
yeah. Oh, right.
Yeah, that was a once in a lifetime opportunity. So start off. So you worked for the congressman. So tell us a little about that. Like, how did you actually come to work for him? What did you do? Yeah. So I guess catch up with that. It's a good place to start.
I guess the easiest way to put it is like, drawing is my business. Cartooning, illustrating, animating, but politics, law, and government has been my family's business for many years, going back, generations. We're from Chicago, although I moved to Boston as a young man. But there have been times where my business was going well. I had a popular comic strip, got turned into a film. Much later, I landed a job drawing at Disney. But there have been other times when the one wasn't paying the bills that I turned to the other. And the best way of putting it is I draw well by choice. I'm good at the family business by osmosis. I just grew up in the kind of household where you learned how to draft a press release, or talking points, or turn in petitions to the county clerk that weren't going to get rejected. And years ago, when my comic strip was doing well in Boston, I was introduced to Barney Frank, who had seen that week's strip. I ran a lot of alt weeklies, also in more gay and lesbian newspapers. But and that week's strip had been critical of Cardinal Law, who was his disgraced eminence, but back then, this is at the height of AIDS, and he had abhorrent views about all that. And I'd been critical of him in the cartoon, and I was at some event, and somebody was kind enough to introduce me to Barney. This was 30 years ago. And he said, good cartoon, like the message. And then he started squinting at me as if like, yes, it's a good cartoon, but cartooning is a pretty a pretty slim reed to, to float your boat on. He said, if you ever need anything else to do, call my office. Maybe we can put you to work. And as it turned out, there were occasions in my life where cartooning wasn't paying the bills, where I did need something else to do. And I did call him, and he did put me to work on 3 separate occasions over the next 25 years, including during the Great Recession, which was my final tour of duty with him, when I was working as a story artist at Disney, learning great things. And, it was amazing to be exposed to a lot of stuff. It wasn't necessarily happy. I spent all my days drawing. I was the lowest person on the storyboarding totem pole. So I would draw like Tinkerbell's sisters, or I would get to color in the Bambis for Bambi 2. Anyway, I lost that job because the recession, forced a lot of layoffs, and it didn't look like there were any storyboarding jobs available in DC. And after, in LA. And after, 6 or 8 weeks, I called Barney, and he said, well, why don't you come to Washington and I'll give you a real job, policy or communications. And so I did. And as that turned out, so politics for me has been absolutely a plan B. I'm an artist with a day job. But that last tour during the Great Recession, while Barney was chairman of the Financial Services Committee, that gave me a pretty excellent front row seat, to tell some of the stories in this book. Not all of them, but definitely the back half, which is about DC. So that's a long answer to your short question. Sorry.
No, it's interesting. It's funny is that we kept on calling it tour of duties. I'm just like, oh my God, is it a tour of duty?
Yeah. I mean, isn't it? I mean, I tell people, and it's like, people ask me, well, is he your boss? Is he your friend? I'm not, it's more like a commanding officer,
Yeah.
I'm not, he's like, it's a tour of duty. And it is public service. Oh, I think you're frozen.
Yeah, I think we both got frozen. So, you talked about how you came to work for the congressman. Like, how did the idea for the graphic novel come about? Like, it seems to be a lot of like graphic memoirs, especially politicians, politics in general, becoming like a really kind of a popular subset of things coming out. So what was kind of the genesis of that?
Yeah. I mean, I'm drawing all the time. I'm always working on a project, and it's not easy to get things published in this day and age, or the margins are this tight, and so I am always working on some sort of cartoon book, and I was working on one that I had a lot of hopes for, and now I'm sort of returning to. After a 4-year hiatus, because I was working on Smahtguy. Barney had mentioned to me, a lot of my political day jobs have involved communications like jobs. I'm a good writer. And he mentioned to me sort of a dissatisfaction with some of the things that have been written about him, because they were so wonky, and they portrayed him as sort of this walking legislative machine. And he's unlike most of them down there, he's a very talented parliamentarian. I mean, he goes home and reads William Wilberforce, like the British parliamentarian in the 1840s that carefully worked through slavery's abolition in the British Isles. Barney's interested in what motion did he use to get that through Parliament? But that's not all he is. by any means. He said, I thought his emotional history, the history of him trying to lead a public life as a gay man on the cusp of Stonewall, but as a younger man, already in a very high-profile position, chief of staff to the mayor of Boston, is still pre-Stonewall. I thought all that was, well, I shouldn't say I thought. He didn't articulate this, but I think he wished that story was told. I told him, well, I'm not Robert Caro, though I love Robert Caro. So, I said, it's not something I would do. And then, then I went home and then I said, but I could draw it, because that's how I deal with the world anyway. I just draw things. I mean, if I've got a day off, I take a sketch pad and go wander around the city and draw and comment. I'm a cartoonist. Like that's what cartoonists do. So, it really was never my intention to write a book about him. I mean, I've thought of 18 books to write in this life, and that wasn't one of them. But when he mentioned it, it did something triggered in me. And I thought, well, I'm also very familiar with the landscapes of his life. Massachusetts, DC, gay America, Jewish America, especially secular Jewish lefty America. And I thought, well, I'm in a pretty good position to tell it. And the thing was, I took the life and times part of it pretty seriously. Like some of my favorite books are telling you what it was like in that world, using the bones of one person's life story. But I felt without, I don't know if I succeeded in this, but in my mind, Boston and New York, I'm sitting in New York, not New York, Boston and DC were very definitive characters in this book. They have a feel to them, and life in those places, and the time that I spent in them, had a feel to them. And I very much wanted to convey that, and using Barney's life story, which I think is pretty captivating, as the bones. Now I've forgotten the question. Sorry.
No, it's good. So it's interesting is like the thing that I read about it is, I mean, it feels there's a rawness to it and an honesty about it. And there's a sadness about it too, right? Like you've got a guy who I said in my review was, in the beginning, he was closeted. He kind of was struggling with his own internal self. And he was, left wing, raging against the machine, really kind of tossing, mixing things up and causing trouble in a good way. And then, as the years go on, you kind of see the transition, and eventually he becomes accepting of himself, happy, like as a time where I almost say, like, it's not there, but that the idea of like gay marriage became more mainstream, acceptable, that part of his life becomes acceptable. And then that kind of rage against the machine aspect of him, he becomes part of the machine. Like there's this really,
well, that's the only place I'm with you until that last sentence. I think, and what I was trying to convey, I don't know whether I did it or not, was Barney was raging against the machine, in the 50s, and he's still raging against it. He just happened to have an odd talent for government, which people don't think in terms of it being a talent, which perplexes me forever. You wouldn't take your dry cleaning to somebody that owns a bowling alley, and you don't take your government to somebody that doesn't know how to pass legislation, which is an actual thing. It's not just some half-wit from North Carolina or Aurora, Colorado, mouthing off. That helps nobody. It doesn't even help the people that they pretend they are helping. Like government is a machinery.
It's complicated.
And the thing is, so the thing about Barney is that he learned pretty early on that he was good at that. That if there was a cranberry grower in Carver, Massachusetts, who had defaulted on his USDA loan, it just happened that Barney would remember that, well, he might be eligible for the small business loan. Like it's stuff like that. It's just, you could be a nuclear physicist, you could be a podiatrist, you could be a lot of things. This is what he's good at. And so I think that I don't think he ever stopped raging. It's just that he was in position, increasingly in a better position to pull the levers of power to affect a sort of change that he wanted. And that he hoped for. And in a way, that's sort of that's a message that I was reaching for. I don't know whether I solved it, but I mean, some of my greatest heroes are activists. Harvey Milk was not a great legislator, but he was an incredibly inspiring leader.
Yep.
Barney's personality isn't inspiring, but I thought, and not even, I admit, like I'm as susceptible as the next person to looking for somebody who inspires me at a sort of a emotive level. But sometimes people like Barney, the more, well, I lost my train of thought. Sorry.
He's a process guy. And you know what? That's a really impressive thing. Like that was, it was something I was not good at, was the process, but I was good at reading the legislation and finding every loophole and problem with it.
Right.
Which is another talent. Like that's not
totally. Totally.
I mean, it really does come across that he's very much a parliamentarian and knew the rules, which to me was super. Like it was a sense that I always got from him, but I think it laid out.
But again, not for sick. I mean, there are people, I think, who just, people who are good at, games or backgammon or bridge, who, I mean, Barney has no great love of knowing the rules. He just knows them. And that's why he figures like, oh, I know these rules better than the opposition. And that's how I'm maybe going to cram, another $40 million in affordable housing credits, into some legislation when nobody's, paying attention. It's sort of like that. I do think like, so I guess that's sort of like, I definitely see what you're saying, and I don't disagree with it, but I think it was always in service of these sort of, liberal ideals for a society that was more just.
Yeah, and that absolutely comes through. I think mine is really probably my perspective on the Great Recession and how that was handled is probably where I'm coming from as far as that. That's the part when I say is the part of the machine.
And I think that makes sense to me. I mean, I sat there thinking, why are we helping these fucking banks? I agree with Tom DeLay.
Yeah,
I can't believe I just said that in a recording. But he was like, "We're not going to spend another cent on these godless banks," and I was like, maybe he's right.
Yeah, I think my perspective, and the reason I said become part of the machine is because my perspective is that we did a more trickle down bullshit, which does not work and screws over the average American when it should have been a trickle up, and that you could have given money to people who are underwater for their houses. They could have then paid their loans and it would have gotten to the banks anyways.
Well, I mean, that's a perfect example. And, there was like that comes up in my book where, the first, I think it was first TARP or second TARP, there was an agreement for there to be foreclosure assistance. that they, in the final days of the Bush administration, they basically didn't honor. But I mean, it's and Barney was furious and actually sort of in that era behaved, recklessly, calling the head of AIG into a hearing and demanding the names of the people that were getting names and addresses of people that were getting bonuses when they shouldn't. There was part of him there, but I mean, but in the end, I guess, you have to, if you have to decide, is he a bomb thrower or is he somebody that's going to take, and I hate this phrase, but I use it in the book myself, so it's, you're fair game to say it, half a loaf. The intention is not to stay with half a loaf. The intention is to come back and swipe the other half as fast and as aggressively as you can, but you're going to take that half right now.
And I think it's the half a loaf part that stuck out to me. I was just like, all right, I kind of feel like he's broken at this, like he's very kind of broken down at this point where it's just the bullshit has been added and added and added. And you can kind of tell at that point, he's just almost like, not that the fire is gone, but just the system has gotten to him and he's just realizing it really is almost a Sisyphean task at that point.
Well, see I think it goes back to his history. Like you said, he's a process guy.
Yeah.
There are many famous, I mean, if you're from Boston, famous activists, famous liberal activists in Boston, and Barney wasn't one of them because he was chief of staff to the mayor. He was more interested in, how can we, how can we bring equity to the schools? How can we build more affordable housing? And those things don't involve a lot of, he's always going to cleave that way. And so I don't think he thinks of it, again, as my mistake for using that phrase, but to him, half a loaf is, like I say, I don't see it as evidence of the machine breaking him down. I see it more as his knowledge of the machine, realizing that he's going to grab what victory he can now because the alternative is no victory at all.
Yeah, and that's definitely that's a political philosophical debate that
and it might not be right. I acknowledge he might be wrong. There might be, maybe you do hold out for, it's playing out right now. I think progressives and liberals are bedeviled by this always. Like, it's like what's the word? So what should your guiding principle be? Are you going to wait on the outside until you have convinced, a working majority, and then sort of, rush up the ramparts and change everything? Or are you going to attempt it more incrementally? And certainly there's plenty of evidence that the incremental approach isn't working at the moment, which makes me sad, but I guess that's what it boils down to. I don't think incrementalists are necessarily in favor of the incremental. I just think they're trying to
they're pragmatic, right? Like we can get what we can get now and it's better than nothing, which I get. Like, I totally get that argument. It's just, to me, it's always a fascinating one, especially when the incremental is just shit sandwich, right?
I totally. And, and there's an example in Smahtguy about that, with Dodd-Frank, which really did bring some order to, the issues are so arcane, it's hard to
that was
all stops and whatever, but in the end, in Dodd-Frank, there was, without getting into all the weird specifics of it, there was a bottom line provision that said, and after that 2,000 pages, whatever the hell's in it, an assessment on the big banks is going to pay for it. you know, an assessment, a tax, however, whatever the mechanism, the big banks got us into this mess are going to pay for these bailouts. And Susan Collins said,
Sorry.
we are in favor of bringing order to the chaos wrought by Wall Street, but we can't agree with paying for it. So, you know, they killed Susan Collins, Olympia Snow, and I think Scott Brown killed the assessment. So, you know, so there is your shit sandwich.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, it's fascinating. I mean, like, the thing is, I really want to hand this off, this book. If you haven't read it, get it. I really want to hand it off to like a non-Politico and see what they have to say about it. Because it's one of those, like, I know my review, and clearly from a review, it was like, at that point, you know, it was 20 years into my career at that point. Like, I've done legislative campaigns, all that stuff. And it's just one of those, like, I know my review was very, very painted due to that experience, like being on that inside and
like
seeing
I say,
it.
I think it's, I mean, I hear you. And and the only thing I would say, like, not about that, because I think you have completely legitimate points. You know, this is like, it's ever thus, like, how, you know, how much, you know, how progressive are you going to be?
Yeah.
But all that aside, like, it was my intention to write a non-political book about politics.
Yeah.
And
well,
like,
that's the thing is the thing that I think is fantastic. And I didn't, you know, I knew he was closeted. He got outed. Like, I knew that story.
yeah.
I didn't know the specifics of it. Because I mean, it was like early 80s when all the hearings, I think it was, or late 80s, was that when like the hearings went down and all that. So like, I didn't know those specifics, all that. But I think the thing that's great about it is it really humanizes him. Like, I felt for him, like, you know, the politics is there, and I'm somewhat of a wonk, so that of course is going to stand out to me. But to me, the bigger aspect was like, it really humanized him. Like, I felt bad for him by the end of it, of being like, it took him 40 something years, I think 40 something years at that point, for him to find happiness and content and being content in his personal life.
Well, that's sort of what I was, you know, and I know, like, at this point in, you know, the history of the world, coming out stories might not be, but I didn't even think of it. I was just, to me, like, politics is, well, it's clearly a dirty word, but and people roll their eyes and expect to be bored. My argument has always been, like, some of the best political stories aren't about the nuts and bolts of politics at all. They're about, like, the whole spectrum of human activity, friendship and treachery, love and violence, loyalty and envy, all rolled up into one and slapped with a label that we call politics. Like, it doesn't, so it's not usually, and I tried to hold off, at least until the end of the book, with too much wonkery about, you know, this bill and that bill and this. I mean, there was some of that all through, but
really the recession is where it kind of got a little wonky. Like, to me, it's about him. It's about this journey of his personal experience, his own personal experience. Forget the politics, like his own personal experience of eventually getting the end. Like, you know, that when he finally got out of politics is when he found happiness.
I mean, that's what I was shooting for. And in that, it's sort of, you know, those are, although, like, I've already admitted that I have a political background, that sort of, like, creative terrain, I'm much more comfortable with. I wrote a comic strip for 5 books from St. Martin's Press. The Ethan Green books, my Ethan Green books were about, you know, a guy's dating life. They weren't about, paying political consultants to develop, you know, effective ads that were going to turn focus groups. You know, like, I hope the book doesn't sound like that.
No, it doesn't. So. No, I mean, I think the personal life I have it stood out to me. And in the end is like, I found at the end where I was just like both sad for him, but also happy for him, which I thought was really interesting. Like it was like, oh, he finally found happiness and all that. And it's like, oh, it was sad that it took him 40 years to do it. And I think the only, I met him a couple times, not many. And the funniest is what it kind of described him. I think one book was like, I don't remember if he used the word gruff or whatever it was, like schlubby or whatever it was, but like that was the initial experiences that I kind of met with him where I'm just like, you're not the worst person in the world.
People, I've spent the last 30 years people saying Barney was mean to me in the airport, or Barney was impolite at the party. And the thing is, I've always said to them, like, you're too young for this, but there was a cartoon, Mark Allen Stamati in the 80s and early 90s, in the Village Voice, the now, well, it's mostly defunct Village Voice, the great alt weekly newspaper from Greenwich Village. And Stamati's column was called Congressman Bob Forehead. And it was a lampoon, a spoof on a blow-dried, focus grouped, grinning, talking out of 9 different sides of his mouth member of Congress, who had no integrity, but was very pleasant. If you're sitting next to him on an airplane for 3 hours, you wouldn't be upset. And that's, I've always thought Barney was the antithesis of that, which makes him interesting. A more modern, an example of that people have discovered that they can live with. A current day example is Bernie Sanders. It's a similar thing. Like these guys aren't winning to be running for miscongeniality, and his personality isn't lovely.
I mean, I can't say anything. I work for Kerry, and he's like, definitely doesn't have the best reputation with the people out there. But when you got to know him, love the guy. He's one of the few I'd go work for again. Like, it was great. Like I actually had great experiences with him. So I'm quite happy about that.
Well, and I think, don't you think, like with a lot of people, people of different sides. I used to get a kick out of the fact that Barney's public persona was so gruff. He wouldn't say, if you call his office, he wouldn't say hello. He wouldn't say goodbye. People would get pissed off about that. And in telling me that story, I'd say, are you aware that he picked up the phone? Yeah. Have you ever called a congressional office before? The idea that the congressman answers the phone. Yes, he wouldn't say hello and goodbye because he's saving time. Yeah. But he was a very unusual character up there.
You didn't get kicked off to an LA. That already is you're ahead of the game at that point.
Right.
Right. So has he read the graphic novel?
Yes. Yeah. Well, we just did an event in Boston last Friday night at the Brattle Theater, not in Boston, in Cambridge. So he's read it, and I think he's pleased with it. I'm sure it's a peculiar experience to see your life converted into cartoons, running across 200 luridly colored pages. I think I think he gets a kick out of it.
I can only imagine. I don't want to hold you too long. No. What stood out to you putting this together about him, or you just putting together a graphic memoir in general?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I think the thing that, a takeaway early on was, this is a tricky operation. It's not fiction, but my intention was to, novelize it, or at least to dramatize it. And so you have to, first it's like, the cutting room floor is filled with discarded material, because you can't tell a life story that that covers everything he did. But isn't that what a biography is? But it turns out least my experience is that's not what a biography is, because I thought you'd lose your audience. I admit one of my heroes, Robert Caro, discards that. I've been reading The Power Broker because I love New York politics. I've been reading The Power Broker for 25 years. I'm only up to the O'Dwyer administration. Like, I've gotten through LaGuardia. I'm about 1943, and there's a long way to go. So, but I thought, like, it couldn't be exhaustive, and so I had to cut out a lot of material. You raised this. You said, what about 2002 to 2007? And you're right, because something very significant happened in those years. I mean, their book ended by two very significant things: 9/11, right? And the Great Recession. But what happened in between? Something very significant: the Iraqi War. And as it happened, Barney voted against that war, unlike many of his establishment compatriots. I think unlike President Biden, I can't remember now, unlike Hillary. But he wasn't a foreign policy lead. And so my thought was, that was the cutting room floor. And so there was a lot of things. That was the big takeaway to me in doing a biography, like picking and choosing incidents that had a bigger import, even if they were tiny incidents. Getting hurt by a guy that seemed interested in him, and then saying the wrong thing, which most of us have been there. Somebody you're instantly attracted to and interested in, and you say the wrong thing, and it sets them off. They spin away from you, and you think, how did that just happen? How did I just make that mistake? But tiny incident, but telling.
It humanized him. Like, that really humanized him. I got there and just kind of did like, I felt really bad for him at that point, because you saw the struggle. Like, to me, I think that was a key moment to include.
Well, I'm glad you thought so. It was actually one of the things that it's hard to interview people for a biography. They don't, they tell you something, that they hold close. Then they don't want to tell you anymore. You lean in and you say, well, what did he look like? What did he sound like? What was the night like? Like, what was, and you have to, people, I found that sort of like filming a screenplay, which I sort of like in graphic novels too. I have to work with the writing has to be there before I pick up the pen. And, so there's a lot of feeling in the dark to what could it have been like sitting on Boston Common on a busy night in 1968 when you got your heart broken. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, to me, that was key. Now, the funniest, I was reading it, a lot of it was also like, I wonder what people I know that will be in this. And it got to around the 2000, I was like, all right, this is about the point where I might start knowing people, and it just skipped that. And I'm like, oh, mother.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I did. I mean, it goes basically from the Clinton, the Lewinsky scandal, but the thing is, I also found, just the nuts and bolts of it, drawing a book about political setting is hell, because it's not like these people spend a lot of time alone. So that's a lot of drawing. It's a lot of faces, and you're wondering, is the reader going to give a damn about all these faces? Like, are they going to be able to focus on this? My partners be like, next time maybe I'll write a graphic novel about a sculptor or something. But so that another thing, to shut me up if I'm running too long.
No, we're good.
But one funny thing that happened to me in the making of this book is that, my cartoonist heroes are not minimalists. I like to, I like to, I'm not a beautiful draftsman, but I like to render the scene, to give you some visual information about these settings. And it was important to me, like, a lot of them, especially, and sort of to find beauty in the mundane, because a lot of this activity takes place in government buildings. And so the weird colors of how fluorescent looks on a wall, I was looking for some of that, but I also just needed some information about, Barney's first job as chief of staff of the mayor of Boston in 1965. Well, City Hall in Boston is sitting right there, but it's not like, if you go online, it's not like you find a lot of pictures of what the guts of the building are like. What does it look like to go from down one corridor from the education staffer's office to the, criminal justice staffer's office? Like, what does the bathroom look like? You don't get to see any of that.
Yep.
And that frustrated me, because I wanted to evoke it. And so it took a lot of work. When the book was done, which was January of 2021, I guess, like about 3 weeks after I had sent it, this very famous documentary filmmaker, I think his name is Frederick Wiseman, he did something called Titicut Follies. He's a famous documentarian. He came out with an hours-long movie called City Hall that's about Boston City Hall. And it lovingly roams from one conference room to the next. It zooms up to the ceiling to see what the ceiling, it shows you what the views what the view out the police commissioner's office looks like. I wanted to, jump off a cliff. So anyway.
Well, I think you got the DC part pretty solid, because there was definitely, when I was looking at it, going, this feels rather familiar.
Okay.
So.
I mean, the problem with DC is, like, how many different shades of ivory can you find?
How many columns can you fit in this picture?
Yeah, sandstone. It's like a symphony in sandstone. With the occasional red, white, and blue and gold.
Yeah. No, you got that part down perfect. No, I liked it. I mean, the great was, a lot of politicos and people I do know, politicians, all that. And I mean, they're all recognizable. I mean, I think you did a great job as far as that. And well, I'm not super familiar with Boston, the little time that I've been there. Like, I recognized what I saw. Obviously DC, I recognized what I saw. So, I mean, I think you nailed as far as that.
Well, thank you. I mean, in Boston, like, just in terms of like graphics and color, Boston was easy. Even, I mean, before I lifted a pen or wrote a note, I was like, it's red. This is like, I'm seeing red. I'm seeing red panels, pink, salmon, because all that brick, and the brick, depending on the time of day, the brick takes on all these different qualities, that's, I don't know, sort of captivates me.
No, that's totally fair. So again, I don't want to hold you too long. So what else are you working on? Where can people maybe find your work, or if anything else you want to plug and get out there?
Well, I am working on what I hope will be my next graphic novel, and it's sort of an expansion of a graphic short story I did called Porno, about a murder in Chicago in the 80s. Gay kid that got murdered, and I published this story in a small magazine called Three, published by Northwest, or not. I'm sorry, published it originally in this compendium that did pretty well, called QU 33R. I've never known how to say it. Queer or
Yeah. I
published
think
by
I know what you're
Northwest
talking
Press.
about. Yeah.
Edited by Rob Kirby, who's a really great cartoonist, great cartoon editor, and that story is sort of dear to my heart. And my hope is to build it out. I
Is
didn't
it a
have
true
the
story?
say what's
Is it
that?
a true story?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna have to fictionalize
Yeah.
parts of it, but yeah, um, it's uh, it's sort of about. I mean, I don't even need to be coy about it. I when I was very young and going to gay venues, rough gay venues in Chicago, secretly. Um, I saw a kid from my hometown, sort of a wealthy, you know, jock, um, in this same place. Of course, we weren't admitting to each other. You just look away because that's the way it was back then. And I saw him get roughed up, and I didn't know what I was seeing. I didn't know whether that was like a thing. Was that something he was into? Like, did he need help? Did he? Uh, and at some point later, um, 3 years, I became aware that he had disappeared. And many, many years later, I became aware that he had been killed. I don't, and so this story is about that. It's about the nature of memory, about what did you see? Can you trust what you saw? Should you have, whatever you did, was that the right thing or the wrong thing? All that rolled up into like 1980s Chicago. That's what I'm working on now.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it sounds weird. Like it's something I would want to read. That sounds kind of fascinating and like a
Well, I
really
hope
interesting,
so. I hope
really interesting
so.
read. Yeah.
It's I mean, what are you working on now is like a question that I think probably if you're smart, you just say just working, because the minute it comes out of your mouth, you think like, ugh. But for whatever it's worth, it is the story was published in this book from Northwest Press, and I was always proud of it,
Yeah.
and I'm trying to build it out because I never wanted it to be that short. It's just they gave me 30 pages, and I tried to tell this story in the allotted pages, but now I'm hoping I'm in a position to tell it more thoroughly.
So the question on that, this is actually kind of an interesting one. So since you're expanding something you've done before, are you using the original 30 pages or like some of it, none of it, starting over?
No, I sort of see it as, often, in this, I look more to my like writing friends who, often take a short story that they published in a literary magazine early on, and that becomes the basis for their first novel. In answer to your question, I imagine you wouldn't use the same pages. It's the, I can't really imagine that would work. I mean, just technically, in terms of, first of all, it was drawn a long time ago. The tools were different. The page specs would be different, but the feel of it and color is important to me. I find it like enormously effective for setting the mood, and that's one of the things that, like, Disney was a scary experience for me. That at the time seemed like, I mean, it seemed a little bit like I was like one of those, those guys, those rowers in some sort of horrid Greek galley, getting like, but I learned a lot. And one of the things I learned was color and mood. And in Porno, the way it was published, in this anthology, which won an Eisner, so it was a pretty big the anthology did well.
Mhm.
The color, the signature color was this lurid pink of that I remember from the sign of this gay movie house in a nasty part of Chicago when I was a kid. And, it's underworldy, takes you to, I don't know if you saw like the Deuce, that thing on HBO 4 or 5 years ago about 42nd Street.
Yeah.
It has that kind of feel. Also very political, just a different political in the broad sense of it, of the word, not about consultants and elections, but anyway, sorry.
Oh no, all sounds good. I
Off.
mean, now I got to go find the anthology. I'm sure I got to like in the review copy somewhere, so I have to go dig that out and check it.
Well, I hope you like it. And it's just sort of preliminary, but that in answer to your question, that's what I'm sort of, I'm looking. You can't see all the Post-it notes on the wall in front of me, but that's what they're all trying to put this together in a way that works. So
interesting, very, very interesting. Well, I really appreciate it. This is something I've been looking forward to, and I've been excited and to chat with you. And I mean, this is a fantastic graphic novel. So I'm
so grateful, and I'm really, I can tell somebody, that knows politics, like it's nice that you appreciate it. You're sort of like, my ideal reader, somebody who's got some, who's not gonna, I guess you're my ideal reader because not to be scared off by the subject matter, because the subject matter doesn't have to. I have friends who'd be like, oh, it's actually not boring. And I'm like, politics isn't boring.
My God, is it not boring?
Book isn't just about politics. So how do you win that? You don't.
I think all my political stories, I don't think I've ever told a process story in my life. Let's just go with that. All my political stories have nothing to do with process.
Right. Exactly.
Well, much appreciated. Thanks so much. And
thank you, Brett. It's a pleasure, really a pleasure meeting you.
Yeah, it was great talking to you too.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.